We've been talking about that Sunday Times poll suggesting that Labour is heading for a landslide victory at the next general election. And the country's most revered polling expert, Professor Sir John Curtis, says that Labour has a 99% chance of getting into power whenever we do have the election later this year. But can Sir Keir Starmer's party take a leaf from the opposition playbook going back to 1922 to learn the lessons from when Labour went from opposition and into power? Let's talk to Richard Johnson, who is a senior politics lecturer at Queen Mary University in London and has written a book called Keeping the Red Flag Flying, the Labour Opposition Since 1922. Richard, hello to you and a happy Easter. Just tell us a bit more about your book. This is about what Labour achieved, how it changed when it was out of power.
So 1922 is the first year that Labour overtakes the Liberals as the second largest party in Parliament, a status that it's held at least that good or better ever since. And we were surprised. I've co-authored this book with two colleagues at Lancaster University, Gavin Hyman and Mark Garnett. And we were surprised that there had never been a book that had looked specifically at Labour's time in opposition. And given that Labour has spent 2/3 the last century in opposition, we thought it was important to see what Labour actually does in opposition, because we don't feel that opposition is merely dead time between sort of a waiting room between periods of government. We believe that opposition can be done well, or it can be done less well. And we wanted to look at how Labour did certain activities that might prepare it for government, such as developing its policies or improving the internal rule book or the way that it appealed to the electorate, or actually also how it performed the role of opposition. So how did it hold the government of the day to account? And so this is the first book that looks specifically at the entirety of Labour's period as the official opposition since it first became the official opposition in 1922.
Yeah, and the Labour leader Harold Wilson once asked how difficult he found being Prime Minister. Not half as difficult as being leader of the opposition, was his reply. And he was somebody who went in and out of power. Do you get the sense that Harold Wilson, when he was out of power, learned lessons that helped him to get back?
Wilson is extraordinary because Wilson is an example of someone who came in as leader of the opposition, won power over the Tories, lost power, then came back and then won two general elections. The only other Labour leader to have lost an election and then from government and then to come back was Ramsay MacDonald in the 1920s. What has struck me in writing this book is that the Labour membership, after each time that Labour's in government, seems very disappointed with Labour's period in government. And there seems to be a common motif of disappointment, of almost recriminations that the Labour government was not radical enough. And that's one of the major challenges that I think a Labour leader has to manage, actually, is the expectations of the activists within the Labour Party. And Wilson, I think, was actually quite good at doing that. Wilson ensured that he had a balanced shadow cabinet with members from across the left and the right of the Labour Party. It caused him some headaches, absolutely. But as Wilson himself said, the Labour Party needs a left and a right wing to fly. And I think he was the master at that.
So if Keir Starmer is to look through your book for an example which he should be following as he makes that translation from opposition into power, where do you see that the successes? Would it be to look at Harold Wilson?
Wilson is the first that I would encourage Starmer to look at. And when Starmer stood for Labour leader in 2020, he did say that he regarded Harold Wilson as sort of his favourite Labour leader, or someone that he took some lessons from. I have to say that I think Starmer's current shadow cabinet is much less politically balanced than Wilson's was. And at the moment, obviously, Labour's doing well in the polls and Starmer seems to be doing perfectly fine in his position as leader. But as time goes on, that may not serve him very well because there won't be much buy-in from the left of the party, or when I say left, I don't just mean the hard left, but the center left of the party as well. There may not be a feeling of buy-in for the mission of a Starmer government. And that was one thing that Wilson was very good at, was that everyone in the party really felt that they had someone in the cabinet who was fighting their corner, from Tony Benn and Michael Foot and Dick Crossman and Barbara Castle on the left to people like Tony Crosland and Roy Jenkins on the right. And my advice to Starmer would be to think about it, his first reshuffle would be to bring in some people actually more from the left of center of the party.
You talked there about expectation management. I mean, it is interesting the way that Sir Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have really been talking up the difficulties that they're going to face, the fact that there is not going to be about a huge amount of money to invest, as when the Blair government came to power and they were able to put huge sums of money into schools and hospitals and so on. Do you think that perhaps Sir Keir Starmer has learned from some of those lessons from the past?
Yes, there are certainly examples of elections where Labour goes in very uh, bullish, expects to win, quite frankly, and doesn't. And we can look at 1992 as a famous example of that. Also, 1959 was a very disappointing election year. Many in the Labour Party thought that Labour had run a very good campaign, and in many respects, Labour had. But the Tories continued to hold a landslide. So there's that side of it, which is don't count your chickens before they hatch. The polls look very good for Labour, but you need to manage the expectations on that respect. And the other, of course, is that you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose, and the job of governing will always require compromises that you don't have to make in opposition. And Labour, a good Labour leader, educates the membership about that and brings them in. Again, it's about making this a collaborative effort, not a dictatorial exercise of leadership.
You dedicated this book to your grandfather, John Jack Johnson, who was a socialist. Just explain his role in all of this.
My grandfather was born in Newcastle, son of a docker. By the time he was a teenager, both of his parents had died. He was a lifelong socialist and member of the Labour Party. And he was a Labour councillor. He stood for Parliament a couple of times, but never became an MP. But his example has always inspired me as someone who gave a huge amount of his time and his energy and intellect to fighting for a cause bigger than himself. And he truly saw Labour as a moral crusade. He was particularly passionate about education. He was very involved in the movement for comprehensive education. And he actually also spoke at the 1952 Labour conference in Morecambe, which is where the three authors in Morecambe itself, we got the idea at a 70th anniversary event of that Labour conference in the Morecambe Winter Gardens. And that was in the very same building my grandfather had given a speech calling for comprehensive education 70 years earlier. So it felt poetic, and it's very kind of my co-authors to agree to dedicate the book to someone who's meant so much to me in my life.
Fascinating stuff. Richard Johnson, senior politics lecturer at Queen Mary University, and co-author of Keeping the Red Flag Flying, Labour Opposition since the 1922 election. And I'm sure that will be required reading for many shadow cabinet members. Great to talk to you, Richard. Thanks so much.